Welcome to York, one of the oldest, most beautiful and most historic cities in England. With no less than 2,000 years of captivating heritage under its belt, and a wealth of pristinely preserved centuries-old landmarks, a walk around York is like a step back in time. And on this tour around the city on a sunny winter's afternoon, we'll take a deep dive into York's truly illustrious history, as we take a walk along the city's famous medieval walls, admire the ghostly ruins of a historic abbey, uncover the legacy behind York's Roman origins, pass by a wealth of historic churches, visit a number of unusually named streets, from Mad Alice Lane to the wonderful Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma Gate, and of course take a stroll down the world-famous Shambles, the narrow medieval street always bursting with tourists and riveting history. All of that is to come over the next hour and a bit, but we begin our walk taking in a view of what is without doubt York's most magnificent landmark of all, the mighty York Minster. Built over the course of multiple centuries, and finally completed in the year 1472, this huge medieval cathedral has dominated the city skyline for hundreds of years, serving as an unmistakable symbol of York's national significance through time. The Minster most notably serving as the seat of the Archbishop of York, the second most senior bishop in the Church of England. But like so much of this great medieval city, the spectacular York Minster has rather humble origins. Much of the eye-catching Gothic architecture that we see today is between 600 and 800 years old, but the cathedral can actually trace its origins all the way back to a smaller church that was built here nearly 1400 years ago in 627 AD, during the Anglo-Saxon period. Over time, that small Anglo-Saxon church was gradually expanded into the behemoth that we know today. But in the shadow of the mighty cathedral, we find an artefact which is even older than the original York Minster. A stone column, which is nearly 2,000 years old, dating from the Roman era. Believed to have been built around the end of the 1st century AD, this column was one of 16 which supported the roof of the Roman Basilica, the headquarters of what they called Eboracum, the northern capital of Roman Britain. Eboracum, as York was known to the Romans, began life as a major fort, founded in the year 71 AD, as Roman legions continued advancing northwards in their conquest of Britain. But over time, what started out as a fort evolved into a major city, so significant in fact that it was visited by emperors all the way from Rome itself. Most famously, Eboracum was visited by none other than Constantine the Great, who in the year 306 AD was crowned as the Emperor of Rome right here in York, very possibly inside the mighty basilica which stood on this site. If you visit the inside of York Minster today, which is thoroughly recommended, not only can you marvel at the spectacular interior of the medieval church, but if you venture down into the cathedral's undercroft, you can also see the remains of the Roman basilica up close, including another column which remains standing in its original position. Above ground, meanwhile, the mighty York Minster wows visitors from all over the world with its breathtaking architecture. The eye-catching circular rose window here, for instance, dating from 1515, which actually makes it one of the newest features of this immense medieval cathedral. As we mentioned, the intricate and imposing Gothic design of this cathedral was painstakingly carved over the course of more than 200 years, and upon its completion, York Minster was the largest cathedral in England, covering an area of more than 50,000 square feet and weighing more than 16,000 tons. And while plenty of the cathedral's visual grandeur was indeed designed to project the power of the church, there's also a lot of detail to its variety of architectural features. The rose window, for instance, was designed to symbolise the union of the rival houses of York and Lancaster at the end of the Wars of the Roses, while the twin west towers that we're looking up at here are among the most intricately designed in the country, complete with carvings etched into the building work by hundreds of medieval stonemasons. Of course, things are just as impressive when you venture inside the cathedral, one of the highlights of any trip to this city. We could certainly keep talking about York Minster for hours, but this is actually just one of more than a dozen churches that you'll find inside the walled city of York. In fact, there are so many churches crammed onto the streets of the medieval city that there's even one that stands directly next door to York Minster. This much smaller but no less fascinating church, known as the Belfry. With its own lengthy history dating back to the 13th century, the Belfry as we see it today is a rebuild of the mid-16th century, completed in 1537, which was just a couple of decades before it hosted the baptism of one of York's most infamous sons, Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes, known for his involvement in the failed gunpowder plot, was baptised at the Belfry in 1570, just a few days after he was born right here in the centre of York, either at the site of the Guy Fawkes Inn here across the street from the church, or just around the corner on the street known as Stonegate. Within the circuit of York's historic walls, you'll find a maze of equally historic streets. Just here, for instance, we find ourselves on High Petergate, which after the crossroads with Stonegate up ahead, becomes Low Petergate. As you'll have noticed, many of York's street names end in the suffix gate, a relic of the period when this city, and much of northern England, was settled by the Vikings. The suffix gate comes from the Old Norse word gata, literally meaning street, although this does complicate things a little when it comes to exploring the history of the actual gates in York's city walls, as we'll discover a little later on in our walk. But before we dive deeper into the streets and stories that make up this magnificent city, let's take a brief moment to pinpoint exactly where in Britain you'd find York. As the name suggests, York is situated in the heart of Yorkshire in northern England, and just over 20 miles northwest of the major city of Leeds, while in a wider scope, York sits roughly at the midpoint between the cities of London and Edinburgh, both just over 160 miles away in opposing directions. That central location, both from a county and national perspective, has put York at the crossroads of so many major events throughout British history, and the city still bears the scars of everything from Viking invasions to medieval civil wars and so much more. York also boasts some of the proudest heritage from the golden age of Britain's railways. The city is fittingly home to some of the country's best Christmas celebrations and a festive history which stretches back to the Roman era. And while the city is indeed famed for its medieval architecture, York's streets are also busy with fetching Georgian-era houses from the 18th century, such as this elegant brick house, which was originally built nearly 300 years ago in 1725. Such is York's age that centuries-old buildings seem almost unremarkable when placed alongside the city's oldest landmarks. But there's so much history here that almost every square inch of the city centre could have its own documentary. For instance, as well as famous buildings, York is also home to a number of small lanes and alleyways which wind their way between the houses, and just here we find one which bears a rather unusual name. Now Lund's Court, this small alley was for a long time known as Mad Alice Lane. According to local legend, a woman named Alice Smith once lived down this lane, and she came to be known as Mad Alice after her execution at York Castle around the year 1825, charged with poisoning her husband. In all truth, the story of Mad Alice Smith is so murky that there's every likelihood it's more fiction than fact. But even so, it's legends like that which lend tremendous character to York's streets, attracting millions of tourists to the city year after year. York is one of the most visited cities in Britain by international tourists, who not only flock here to sample the city's medieval flavour, but also to enjoy the wide array of shops that we see surrounding us on streets like Low Petergate. and also to take part in some of the famous ghost walks in the city after dark, which can feel rather spooky as night descends and the many day trippers return home. But today we're most interested in York's history, and just here we've stumbled upon the King's Square, today home to a lovely merry-go-round, but which was once very different. Back in the Roman era, this was the site of the southeastern gate in the walls of Eboracum. Meanwhile, in the medieval era, a few centuries afterwards, some say that a royal palace stood in this part of York. This was likely the seat of the Viking leaders of the Danelaw, the Norse-controlled portion of England. But the palace may have even existed before the Vikings, serving as the home of the monarchs of Deira and Northumbria, medieval kingdoms of which York was capital. Whatever the truth, the palace was long since demolished by the time that many streets in York took their current form, and there are few streets in this city more famous than the one before us here, the Shambles. Often touted as the oldest street in York, the Shambles is an international tourist attraction, in recent years because it's said to have served as the inspiration for the atmospheric Diagon Alley in the Harry Potter stories. Contrary to what many may think, the scenes for the Harry Potter movies at Diagon Alley weren't actually filmed on York's Shambles. But while the street's wizarding connections have made it very popular with tourists, as we can see, its true origins lie elsewhere. Today, we use the word shambles to refer to something that's a bit of a mess, total chaos. But once upon a time, the word was used to refer to the place where animals were slaughtered and their meat was sold. That is where the Shambles gets its name from. For centuries, it was the place in York where people came to buy their meat. And in fact, until as recently as the 1880s, there were more than 30 butcher's shops crammed into the buildings of this famously narrow street. As for the buildings which line the Shambles today, many are among York's oldest still in everyday use. Some of the houses surrounding us are up to 700 years old, dating from the 14th century, when this street began to take the form that we see today. Each and every building on the Shambles has an extensive history. This house, for example, was once the home of a woman named Margaret Clitheroe, wife to a local butcher, and who became known as the Pearl of York. She was even made a saint for protecting Catholic priests during a period of religious upheaval in the mid-16th century. None of the historic butcher's shops remain on the Shambles today, although just to the right up ahead is a passageway which leads out into the Shambles marketplace, today the main market in the centre of York. We'll be visiting the market later on in our walk, but let's now turn off the world-famous Shambles and into another of York's intriguing alleyways, one with perhaps the strangest name of all. Hidden away here at the bottom of York's most famous street is Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma Gate, a street unlike any other. Apart from being one of the shortest streets in York, if not the shortest, Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma Gate's bizarre name has an equally bizarre history, and unsurprisingly, no clear origin. Some say that Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma Gate is a corruption of the older name Whitnor-Whatnor Gate, which is literally said to mean something like, "What a street." The origins for this theory go back to the Vikings, who are said to have named the street as a bit of a joke, mocking its short length, and so the name could also be translated as a kind of sarcastic, "You call that a street?" Another theory is linked to the idea that the city of York's old whipping post was actually situated on this street, at the intersection of a number of major roads in the city centre. It may be then that Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma was simply the sound of a whip cracking, as criminals and ne'er-do-wells were publicly lashed for their misdeeds. Again, like so much of this centuries-old city, the truth may just be lost to history. But as we now back away from Whip-Ma-Whop-Ma Gate and the old parish hall of St Crux, we're now making our way into an entirely different part of York, the historic Merchants' Quarter, which is based around Fossgate, just here. Taking its name from the small river Foss, which it crosses just a short distance up ahead, Fossgate is home to a number of interesting spots. For instance, just here, there stands the Blue Bell, said to be the smallest pub in all of York, and which opened its doors back in 1798. But Fossgate's history, unsurprisingly, goes back much further. The street was actually laid out all the way back in the Roman era, although during that time it actually lay outside the walls of Eboracum. It was only in the Viking era that this street became an integral part of the city, emerging as a centre of commerce and industry, hence the name Merchants' Quarter. Although the street today is also home to a number of more modern landmarks, like this distinctive building, which was constructed back in 1911 as the very first purpose-built cinema in the city of York. Now, 20th century heritage like that almost seems a rare find, given so much of York's historic centre is protected. And so of course we're never far away from a marvellous medieval landmark, although sometimes you need to know where to look. Here, for example, we find a fetching brick building of the early 17th century, home to a pair of shops which stand either side of a doorway and a beautiful coat of arms. If you're strolling down Fossgate, then don't pass by this doorway without venturing inside, because it's the entrance to the spectacular Merchant Adventurers Hall, which is one of the oldest and best preserved medieval guild halls in the whole world. This gorgeous timber-framed building is more than 650 years old, built in the mid-14th century as the headquarters for a local guild, composed of influential tradespeople who worked in this city. Now, merchants' associations like this, known as guilds, were once commonplace in towns and cities up and down the country, and more widely across Europe too, and they worked to promote the interests of their respective industries, with local tradespeople clubbing together to aid one another. Guilds regularly met at guild halls, hundreds of which you would have found all over Britain centuries ago. But what's special about this guild hall in York is that it's a little older and quite a bit larger than most others in the country. In fact, this is one of the largest timber-framed buildings still standing in Britain today, and it exists largely unchanged from the time when it was built more than 6 centuries ago. The upper floor, timber-framed and yellow in colour, is the Great Hall, historically the main room inside which the guild would meet. Below it, meanwhile, behind the bricks, is the Undercroft, a much smaller space that was never used by merchants, but rather served as a hospital for the poor and sick people of York. These are the 2 oldest parts of the Guildhall, although tacked onto the side of the building we also see a brick chapel, built in 1411. After all, while guilds did exist primarily as commercial institutions, there was much more to them than just that. Many also had a religious edge, and they also sought to provide a social benefit for the communities in which they operated. Charitable efforts like the hospital in the Undercroft have long been a part of the history of the guilds. And in fact, the company of merchant adventurers, for whom the hall was built here in York, is still in existence today, now serving only as a charitable institution, although they do still meet on occasion at the Great Hall. But just along from the medieval Merchants' Hall, here we find ourselves crossing the River Foss, the small waterway which lends its name to Fossgate, which we can see spanning the river on the bridge just in front. Now the Foss, just 19 miles in length, is the smaller of 2 rivers that you'll find flowing through York city centre. Its partner is the much larger River Ouse, which is by many counts one of the longest rivers in Britain. For centuries, the rivers of York helped the city to blossom. Waterborne trade began in the Roman era, was majorly developed in the Viking era, and by the 14th century it helped York to become one of the most prosperous and wealthiest cities in England. It was around that time that this building came into existence. The Red Lion pub, housed inside a beautiful timber-framed building, which dates at its oldest from the 15th century, and which claims to have once been visited by the infamous English highwayman Dick Turpin, who made a hasty escape from the pub through a hole in the ground in the early 18th century. Turpin is one of those names which you'll hear popping up a lot when you're in York. Originally from Essex, he made a living as a highwayman, a thief who would steal from travellers on Britain's roads. Long pursued by the long arm of the law, Turpin is said to have once ridden on horseback all the way from London to York here. And while hiding from the authorities, he assumed a fake identity and took up residence in Yorkshire, before his eventual capture and execution back in 1739. He was buried in a small graveyard just a few streets away, but the stories of his crimes have become the stuff of legend since his death, one of many folkloric figures who've strolled along the same streets that we're exploring today. Here we're walking along Walmgate, which takes its name from one of the gates in the medieval city walls, the Walmgate Bar. Remember, in York, the word gate usually refers to a street, whereas an actual gate in the city walls is known as a bar, creating the rather confusing situation where, in York, streets are called gates, gates are called bars, and bars are, well, pubs. We'll get the hang of it as we continue walking around the city. But just here we've stumbled across one of York's many humble churches, the Church of St. Denis. This is one of the oldest churches in York, with a truly remarkable history. Archaeological digs have suggested that it stands on top of the remains of an old Roman temple, while the very first Christian church to stand on the site was built all the way back in the Anglo-Saxon era, well over 1,000 years ago. Since then, St. Denis's church has had plenty of ups and downs. In fact, it's even known to some people in York as the Unlucky Church. It's much smaller today than it once was. Part of the building collapsed in the late 18th century when nearby building work caused the ground to subside, while the old church spire, which is no longer in place, was hit by a cannon during the English Civil War in the 17th century. Just as we mentioned earlier, a city as old and significant as York doesn't get through 2,000 years of history without a few bumps and scrapes. And despite the fact that it is still home to a breathtaking array of beautifully preserved historic buildings, York is a city that is constantly changing. Just here we find ourselves on Piccadilly, one of the newest streets in York, which has an often unsung history. Lined by modern office buildings, apartments and hotels, Piccadilly may not have the old-world charm of the rest of the city centre, but there is an interesting story behind it. In particular because this street didn't even exist for most of York's history. For hundreds of years, this part of York was covered by water, a shallow marshy area and a large fish pond, just beside the course of the River Foss. Over the centuries, however, water drained from the pond, and it eventually dried up enough for people to start forming a lane through it, which eventually became Piccadilly here, named after the famous street down in London. That name is an indication, at least, of what developers in the city hoped that this street would become. In the early Victorian era, the old lane through the fish pond was widened and redeveloped, and it was hoped that York's wealthy elite would move to new houses in the more spacious surroundings of Piccadilly, away from the tight lanes of the historic city centre. Unfortunately, as we can see, that never quite panned out. Piccadilly was just a bit too detached from all the action in the heart of York to attract people to come and live here. And so it spent most of the 19th and 20th centuries lined with workshops, small factories, and other industrial facilities. Today, new hotels and more have taken advantage of the street's size and lack of protected status. Although at the end of Piccadilly we do find a bit of history, in the form of one of the towers of York's famous city walls. Now, York's walls, like so much of the city, can trace their origins back to the Roman era, although today very little actually remains of the Roman walls which surrounded the fort of Eboracum. As York grew in size throughout the medieval era, the walls were built to cover a much larger area, and so the circuit that exists today dates mostly to the 13th and 14th centuries. This tower, which is known as the Fishergate Postern Tower, is a little newer, built in the first decade of the 16th century to defend the southeastern side of the city, and also to stand over the marshes and fish pond beside the River Foss. Just beside the foot of the tower, you might also be able to spot a small archway in the walls, one of the smallest gates in what is the longest circuit of walls in any city in England. Of course, in the last couple of centuries, the need for defensive walls has become a bit less pressing, and so the formidable medieval defences which once encircled York are no longer a complete circuit, having briefly fallen into disrepair in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Fortunately, recognising their historic worth, York's city walls were restored by the Victorians, and today they remain among the best preserved medieval defences in the country. And as we mentioned, we'll be taking a walk on top of the walls themselves a little later on in our tour. For now though, we're crossing over the River Foss once again, flanked by some of York's newest buildings on the right bank, and on the left bank, the complex which houses one of its oldest of all, York Castle. Now York's Castle, as the main fortress in one of England's most historically important cities, is a little bit different to many others that you'll find around the country. Historically separated from the rest of the city, and surrounded by its own circuit of walls, York Castle is almost like a small community of its own, home not just to the famous Castle Keep, but also law courts and other civic buildings which were involved in the running of the city of York, and the county of Yorkshire more widely. Just here we're walking past some of the remaining castle walls, which wrap around the back of a group of newer buildings that occupy the castle complex. And when we say newer, that is of course in York terms. Behind the trees in the middle of this rather autumnal scene, we can see the back of York Crown Court, the city's main courthouse, which is housed inside a building of 1777. For a long time, the courthouse was the home of the York Assizes, the court where judges who toured the nation would sit and hear cases in the name of the monarch, dealing out justice so that the king or queen didn't have to give a final ruling on every legal tiff up and down the country. During that period, this was the centre of legal authority in Yorkshire, the historic county which of course takes its name from the city of York, and which spans across a huge area of northern England. By far and away the largest county in the country, Yorkshire is home to a number of other major cities, including the likes of Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield, Hull and more. But the county's spiritual heart is of course York, and just here we stumble across one of the oldest and most significant buildings in the whole county, the famous Clifford's Tower of York Castle. Now, as we can see today, Clifford's Tower is covered in scaffolding, part of restoration work to keep this historic landmark in tip-top shape, because it's more than 700 years old. This stone tower is the old keep of York Castle, the central tower which was more fiercely defended than any other, and it's situated atop a man-made mound, which is known as a motte. This is how the tower usually looks without its scaffolding, an icon of York that can trace its history back to the era of William the Conqueror in the late 11th century. William ordered the construction of a castle here, between the rivers Ouse and Foss, to keep watch over the city of York, where local rebellions against his conquest of England had only just been suppressed. The castle then was a symbol of new Norman power over the city, although at that time Clifford's Tower was not the one that we see today, rather a wooden tower which stood until an infamous event around a century after it was first built. In the year 1190, York Castle was attacked by a fierce mob of locals, whose anger was directed at a group of about 150 people from the city's Jewish community, who had taken refuge inside the castle keep. This came during a period of immense religious tension between England's Jewish minority and Christian majority, and while the handful of Jews living in York were granted safe haven by the royal castle, things rapidly turned sour when the fortress was besieged by hundreds of locals. We'll pick up on the story of the events of 1190 in a moment, because while Clifford's Tower inevitably draws the eye of many visitors walking through this part of York, just down the road here we can see one of the city's most fetching Victorian buildings. That is the York and Selby Magistrates Court, built back in 1892 in a spectacular Gothic style, overlooking Clifford Street, which of course takes its name from Clifford's Tower of York Castle. As for the tower itself, the origin of the name is a little uncertain. It may refer to the once influential Clifford family, while some suggest that the name refers specifically to Roger de Clifford, a nobleman of the 14th century who took part in a controversial rebellion against King Edward II, and when he lost, he was executed at York Castle, with his corpse said to have been left on display at the tower. But this was well over 100 years after the events of 1190, when that angry mob of York locals began laying siege to the castle, protecting the city's Jewish community. For some unknown reason, as the attack progressed, trust between the castle guards and the Jews inside broke down. And so, upon realising that there was no safe way out, the Jews of York committed a mass suicide, so as not to fall into the hands of their persecutors. This was the largest anti-Semitic massacre in England for the time, and while a small Jewish community did reappear in York in the following years, 100 years after the massacre, in 1290, King Edward I infamously expelled all of the Jews from England, an exile which lasted more than 300 years until the 17th century. We must, however, move on from that sobering piece of local history, because here we're passing by the beautiful Fairfax House, a fetching Georgian-era townhouse that was built in the 1740s for a wealthy local merchant. From the site of York Castle and past Fairfax House, we're once again approaching the busiest and oldest part of the city centre, which is home to a wealth of historic churches just like this, St Mary's Church. Tucked away beside Castlegate here, St Mary's boasts the tallest church spire in York city centre, constructed back in the 15th century when much of the church was rebuilt. Nowadays the church is no longer in use, instead converted into a space regularly used for art and culture exhibitions. But as you'll likely have noticed, this is just one of dozens of churches which stand on the streets of York city centre, the historic walled city home to one of the densest collections of churches of any city in the country. Most of York's churches, including St Mary's, date from around the time of the 14th and 15th centuries, by many measures the city's medieval heyday, when a large population of around 13,000 people lived inside the city walls. This would have made York one of Britain's largest cities at the beginning of the 15th century, with a vibrant economy and a bustling atmosphere. And as we mentioned a little earlier, a lot of this was a result of development of the city under the Vikings. Just here beneath the twinkling Christmas lights, we're passing by one of York's most popular tourist attractions, the Jorvik Viking Centre, a visitor experience which showcases what life in this city was like when York existed as the capital of the Viking settlements in England. Back in the 9th century, Scandinavian peoples began settling widely across northern and eastern England, raiding and subsequently invading territories from Anglo-Saxon communities who'd been living here since the end of the Roman era. In the year 866 AD, the Danish army swept across northern England and conquered the city of York here, which they christened Jorvik. They made the city the capital of the new Kingdom of Jorvik, covering much of modern-day Yorkshire, and believe it or not, Lancashire too. And as we pass by All Saints' Church here, one of the finest of York's many medieval churches, the city spent close to 100 years under Viking rule, during which time river trade on the Ouse was developed, and the city grew substantially in size, particularly as it became a hub of metal production, using raw British materials sourced from as far away as Cornwall. But despite having such a major impact on the city, Norse rule didn't last forever. In the year 954 AD, the last Scandinavian king of Jorvik, a man known as Eric Bloodaxe, was killed in battle by the armies of the emerging kingdom of England. Despite it being more than 1,000 years since its last days under Viking rule then, York and the rest of Yorkshire retain a rich Viking heritage. But on this day, the people of York are a little more caught up in getting into the festive spirit. And here we find the heart of the city's Christmas celebrations on the wide-open Parliament Street. Always packed with people in the run-up to Christmas, Parliament Street is one of the liveliest parts of York's historic centre. But the width of the street is rather unusual for a city made up mostly of narrow medieval lanes. There is a good reason for this. Parliament Street is another which didn't actually exist for most of York's history. In fact, until the mid-19th century, this street was entirely covered by buildings. Between 1834 and 1836, however, those buildings were demolished, as city planners sought to create a central space for York's markets, which historically had been split between two different sites in the city, one held on Pavement just behind us, and the other held on St Sampson's Square at the other end of this street. By demolishing the houses that once stood here, the two separate marketplaces were linked up as one, with a wide open space that allowed people to leisurely stroll past stalls selling all kinds of goods. Behind the Christmas tree here, meanwhile, is the entrance to the Shambles Market, an extra marketplace which was laid out in the 1950s, just beside the historic Shambles. Today, the Shambles Market serves as the main venue of York's daily market. The historic daily market on Parliament Street here, now only held once a week, apart from when the street is of course taken over by the Christmas market that we see today. Meanwhile, the old market on St Sampson's Square, just up here, was closed down upon the opening of the Shambles Market. But the festive stalls that fill the square today bring back a bit of that historic charm, if only for a few weeks each year. Now though, we're going to make our way off St Sampson's Square and away from the heart of York's delightful Christmas festivities. From here, we're going to start walking towards the other side of the walled city, a quieter but no less historic area that you'll find on the other bank of the River Ouse, the larger of the two in the centre of York. There, we'll take a stroll on top of just a section of the city's famous walls, which offer some of the very best views of the surrounding landscape and towards the towers of York Minster. But before we get there, we remain in the heart of the city's modern shopping district. This street, known as Feasegate, leading towards Market Street. Now you'll notice that in this part of the city, our surroundings appear rather more modern, certainly compared with the old world charm on display in the Shambles and the like just a few blocks away. There are a number of reasons for this, one being that this part of the city historically lay outside the boundary of the old Roman walls. But more important is the fact that Market Street, as the name suggests, was one of a number which were redeveloped in the mid-19th century, when York's historic markets were linked up together. Now, markets have been held in York for longer than almost any other city in England. They were first established by the Romans, who arrived here at the end of the 1st century AD. And over the years, markets came to encompass a vast area of the city centre here, with each street known for selling specific goods. Earlier, we walked along the Shambles, where people went to buy their meat. But here we find ourselves on Spurriergate, a short street which was known for the sale of spurs, metal implements worn on the back of your boots when riding a horse, the kind you see on cowboy boots. The spurs which were made and sold here gave rise to the name Spurriergate, and Spurriergate is punctuated at its end here by the old church of St Michael, yet another of York's seemingly endless array of medieval churches, this one also constructed around the time of the 14th and 15th centuries. Much smaller than it once was, the church was reduced in size during the Victorian redevelopment of York's main shopping streets, and today this historic place of worship is used as a delightful cafe and tea shop, one of the city's many medieval landmarks which have been cleverly repurposed for the modern day. But having rounded the corner from Spurriergate, we now find ourselves on Low Ousegate, which is going to lead us for the first time over the River Ouse, the historic waterway which runs through the heart of the walled city of York. So far we've been exploring the eastern bank of the River Ouse, home to the majority of York's oldest streets and landmarks, as well as the entirety of the old Roman fort of Eboracum. The Romans chose to build their fort between the two rivers, taking advantage of natural defences provided by the rivers on two sides. But as the fort grew into a city, it began to spill over onto the opposite bank of the Ouse. When the city walls were expanded in the medieval era, they were built to encompass the city on both sides of the river, which is crossed by the bridge that we find ourselves on now, the Ouse Bridge. A bridge has spanned the river at this point since the Roman era, but the one which exists today was only built 200 years ago in the 1820s, as heavy traffic through the centre of York became more commonplace. As for the river that flows beneath us, it was the heart of that thriving waterborne trade which helped the city to such prosperity under the Vikings and then the Normans. For centuries, the riverbanks were packed with warehouses and wharves loading and unloading goods of all sorts. But trade wasn't the only thing that people used the river for. This is actually the fifth Ouse Bridge, the river crossing having changed shape a number of times through history. It began as a wooden bridge, before the first stone bridge was built in the medieval era. And a little known fact about that bridge is that back in 1367, the very first public toilets in Yorkshire, and possibly England, were built overhanging the river, which rather delightfully served as a natural sewer, as well as a vital place of trade. And that lovely bit of local history welcomes us to the western bank of the Ouse, a part of York which is often overlooked by visitors to the city. Though it may not have the narrow streets and wealth of timber-framed houses compared to the other side of the river, here we'll find some of York's most fetching Georgian houses, yet more historic churches, and the city's train station, which is one of the most important on Britain's rail network. For instance, just across the road here, there stands the old church of St. John, which features stonework dating back as far as the 12th century. It's one of the larger places of worship in York, although it hasn't been used for religious purposes since 1934, most recently being the home of a cocktail bar, a fantastic setting for a drink. In previous years, the old church has also played host to an arts centre and an archaeological centre, once again showcasing the many different ways that York's medieval churches have been repurposed for the modern day, all the while keeping their history alive and well. We'll see a couple more churches as we make our way up along this street, which is known as Micklegate, stretching from the banks of the Ouse up towards the Micklegate Bar, which, if you remember correctly, is a gate in the city walls. Now, the street known as Micklegate is one of the oldest on this side of the river, and can trace its origins back to the Roman era, when it served as a road stretching from Eboracum to the smaller settlement of Calcaria, known in the modern day as the town of Tadcaster, about 10 miles to the southwest of here. Over time, a large civilian community began developing along Micklegate's path, but the street as we know it today was redeveloped by the Vikings, who named it Miklagata, roughly translating as the Great Street. That, of course, is where the modern name Micklegate comes from, although many people in York use the term to refer not only to the main street, but also a number of the smaller streets which branch off it. Micklegate then, a handy catch-all term for the part of the walled city on this side of the river. Now, just on the other side of Micklegate, the street, we find yet another church, this one known as the Church of St. Martin-cum-Gregory. Like many of York's other churches, this one has origins dating to the 11th century, and it was largely rebuilt in the 15th century. But it still stands out a little, particularly because of its distinctive tower, which was clad with red bricks in the 17th century. Like St. John's back down the road, St. Martin-cum-Gregory is no longer used for worship, now serving as the home of a stained glass centre. But you may be wondering at this point why Micklegate is home to two churches so close to one another. Well, apart from the fact that we're about to stumble across yet another church just a few doors further up the street, the density of churches along this street points us back to the fact that Micklegate was home to a large civilian population in the medieval era. In the 11th and 12th centuries, when the three churches of Micklegate were built, this area of York was home to hundreds of people, who were generally among the poorer of the city's population at the time. Micklegate remained a poor area until the 14th century, when the main street here became awash with houses belonging to wealthy merchants, many of whom were making their fortunes down by the river just a short distance away. For centuries from that point onwards, Micklegate became one of the most prestigious streets in York, and that's why we see the street today lined by a wealth of splendid Georgian-era buildings, 18th century houses that were built for the wealthiest members of the day. But we promised one more church on this storied street, And lo and behold, across the road we can see Holy Trinity Church. You can probably fill in the gaps by now. Like many others in York, Holy Trinity can trace its origins back to the 11th century, and it was largely rebuilt in restorations of the 15th century and later the Victorian era too. However, unlike its fellow churches on Micklegate, Holy Trinity remains in use as a place of worship, boasting a proud religious history that goes all the way back to its original founding in the year 1089, when it served as part of a medieval monastery known as Micklegate Priory. The priory was established by a group of Benedictine monks who came to York from France, and as such the church is the only monastic building which remains standing in the city today. In the churchyard here, meanwhile, we find another intriguing piece of history, in the form of these wooden stocks. Historically used for public punishment, these stocks are a replica of the originals, which are believed to have stood here for around 500 years, since the 16th century. If you want to see the original stocks, they're on display just inside Holy Trinity Church, which of course stands directly across the street from a row of yet more gorgeous Georgian houses, and just next door to them a small pub, known as the Falcon Tap. The Falcon is one of no less than 7 pubs which stand on Micklegate, and which together form York's most famous pub crawl, the Micklegate Run. Now the Micklegate Run sees groups of increasingly plastered revellers making their way up this street, past beautiful historic buildings like this row of black and white 14th century houses, and towards the Micklegate Bar, the gate in the city walls which we'll venture through in a few moments. Merriment is very much the order of the day on a pub crawl up Micklegate, but if you're keen on discovering a bit of history as you sip down your 6th pint of the night, then take a moment to pause just here at the top of Priory Street, which of course takes its name from the medieval monastery that once existed here. The monastery existed for over 400 years, until it was closed down in the 16th century, and while only Holy Trinity Church remains today, here we find the Priory Pub, another stop on the Micklegate Run. Housed inside a row of yet more distinctive 14th century houses, the pub's current name of course commemorates the former monastery, but it wasn't always known as the Priory. Historically, the pub was known as the Coach, suggesting that it was once a venue for people travelling in and out of York to board or park horse-drawn coaches, some of which would carry travellers from the city to a variety of far-flung destinations around the country. Once upon a time, Micklegate here formed part of the main route that ran up the spine of Britain, between London and Edinburgh, and that required coaches to pass through one of the most fearsome gates in York's formidable city walls. This is the Micklegate Bar, originally built in the 12th century to guard the approach to the city from the south, and that location made it the most important gateway in medieval York. Facing south, Micklegate Bar traditionally was the one through which kings and queens arriving from London entered the walled city, and as such it was often the focus for grand events, especially when welcoming a monarch into town. According to tradition, the monarch should stop at the Micklegate Bar and ask permission to enter the city from the Lord Mayor of York, who once upon a time would have then opened the fearsome Barbican, a fortified gatehouse which once stood here on the outside of the gate. Instilling terror in those who approached was also an important purpose of this gateway. Historically, the severed heads of rebels and traitors, including famous names like Henry Hotspur and Richard, Duke of York, were displayed on the Micklegate Bar. Rather gruesomely, this custom continued until the mid-18th century, when the military defences of York eventually began to reduce in importance. In fact, as we now climb up on top of the bar, this historic gateway wasn't only used for defensive purposes. In fact, there were people living here directly over the road for centuries, until as recently as 1918. Today, though, the gateway is a fantastic landmark on the circuit of York's world-famous city walls. And as we walk across the Micklegate Bar, and the street that runs beneath it, it's from this gate that we're going to begin a stroll along the top of the city's mighty medieval defences. From Micklegate, we're going to walk around the western corner of the city walls, back towards the River Ouse, which interrupts their circuit. Now, if you're visiting York, then taking a walk on top of the walls is an absolute must, because it not only helps you get up close with some of the city's best preserved medieval features, but it also lets you appreciate the scale of this city from a different angle. As we mentioned earlier, York's walls are the longest of any city in England, surrounding what was one of the largest medieval cities in the country. Of course, in the modern day there is much more to York than just what you'll find inside the walls. It's home to nearly 150,000 people, the great majority of whom live in the vast urban sprawl surrounding the historic city centre. Once upon a time, those living outside the walls would have been separated from the city centre by moats, which have now largely disappeared. Although the slopes that we can see stretching down from the walls here are remnants of the earthen ramparts, embankments upon which the walls were built in the 13th century, an entirely unique feature among all of England's medieval city walls. Now, with the sun setting over the city on this gorgeous winter's afternoon, the views from the walls are among the best that you'll get all year. But while it's very tempting to focus just on what you can see from on top of the defences, the fortifications themselves are well worth learning about too. It can take anywhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours to walk an entire lap of York's city walls, and so that's plenty of time to note their many interesting features. Not only the large embankments, another example of which we can see down here, but also the many gates that punch a hole in the walls, from medieval bars like the one at the end of Micklegate, to a number of newly created openings which were made to ease congestion inside the walled city in more recent centuries. Now, once upon a time, a large number of Britain's towns and cities were also surrounded by defensive walls. But during the Industrial Revolution, they proved more of a barrier to expansion for rapidly growing urban areas. As a result, where they hadn't yet been destroyed by war or simple decay, most places around the country chose to demolish their medieval walls. But because York here was one of the most significant medieval cities in the country, and also because it didn't grow quite as quickly as larger industrial cities like Leeds, Manchester and more, the historic fortifications were instead retained and restored, preserving them for future generations to explore, just as we're doing today. Of course, there's plenty of more recent heritage to discover on the walls too, because just on the outside of the defences, and across the road, we're passing by the huge building which houses York's railway station, one of the largest and most important on Britain's mainline network. Opened back in 1877, York Station is situated on the East Coast Main Line, one of the busiest in the country, linking London with Edinburgh. York, which as we mentioned lies roughly halfway between the two, was historically used as a hub for the manufacturing and maintenance of locomotives, but the station that we know today wasn't the first to exist in this city. The very first railway station in York actually stood just outside the Micklegate Bar, opened back in 1839 on a line connecting this city with the industrial hub of Leeds. But just 2 years later in 1841, as Britain's railways began expanding rapidly, a new station was built, although rather bizarrely inside the city walls, and it was located just to our right, roughly where these new apartment blocks and the modern Grand Hotel stand today. Obviously then, that station didn't last forever, its position inside the walls proving a major inconvenience. And so in the 1870s, this huge new station was built, no longer hindered by the medieval fortifications. Today, York Station provides a wonderful welcome to those visiting the city. It's a gorgeous throwback to the Victorian era and the golden age of steam, with a beautiful iron and glass roof standing over the tracks, and plenty more elegant features to spot as well. But if you're really into your railway heritage, then there are few better places in the country to visit than York. Outside of the station itself, there are plenty of points of interest to explore. Just here, for example, we're walking past the site where the old York Station of 1841 once stood, and it's depicted roughly from where we're standing in this Victorian-era illustration. In recognition of the old station, these recently redeveloped offices also feature glass canopies which mimic the original goods sheds and platforms that once stood at this point. But to get even closer to York's illustrious railway heritage, you only need look back outside the walls. Just on the other side of the modern train line, you'll find the National Railway Museum, one of the very best museums in Britain, which plays host to some of the most famous railway locomotives in the country's history, often including the iconic Flying Scotsman, which used to run through York on its speedy journeys up and down the East Coast Main Line. The Flying Scotsman was originally built 100 years ago back in 1923 for the London and North Eastern Railway, who operated services along the East Coast Main Line between London, the northeast of England, and Scotland. Throughout its career on Britain's railways, the train covered more than 2 million miles, eventually retiring from service back in 1963. Although today you can often see the Flying Scotsman moving under its own steam once again, on one of many heritage trips which either start or end at York. But long before the Flying Scotsman first rolled out onto the tracks, Britain's railways were rather more fragmented. The London and North Eastern Railway, or LNER for short, was actually a merger of a number of different railway companies from across the country, one of whom was the North Eastern Railway. As the name suggests, the North Eastern Railway covered the northeast of England, stretching up towards the Scottish border. But the company was headquartered right here in York, at the splendid Edwardian building which we find just here. Built over 6 years on an immense scale, and finally completed in 1906, the grandeur of the North Eastern Railway's former HQ here points towards the fact that it was one of the richest railway companies in Britain for its time. The company held a near monopoly on railway lines in the northeast of England, and so with all of the wealth that their operations brought in, they opted for a palatial new building to base their main headquarters, one of York's great 20th century architectural feats. But that's not all. Standing just outside the building, you may have noticed a rather tall obelisk. That's part of the North Eastern Railway War Memorial, which was specifically commissioned by the railway company to pay tribute to all their employees who left to fight in the First World War and lost their lives in battle. Today, the former North Eastern Railway HQ is used as York's exquisite Grand Hotel, and it's been refurbished with all the elegant trappings of its Edwardian heyday. So York's not all about Roman and medieval history. Its more recent heritage is well worth exploring too. But as we continue making our way along the route of the walls, in the distance we can see towards the towers of York Minster, standing tall above the low-lying buildings of the historic city centre. And as we look out from the walls towards York's Memorial Garden, home to the City of York's own war memorial, which is dedicated not just to those who worked for the railway company, we're now going to make our way back towards York Minster, where we started our walk and where we'll reach the end of our tour in around 20 minutes' time. But this being York, there is still plenty more to see and discover, and we've yet to visit many more major city landmarks, including the Yorkshire Museum, the medieval ruins of St Mary's Abbey, and the Bootham Bar, just to name a few. Here though, we're coming towards the end of this section of York's walls, the vital defences which protected this city from outside attack for so long. But who exactly were the armies seeking to break through these walls and to capture York? Well, this city, with its royal credentials and vast wealth, was always a major prize for those fighting against the English monarchy. This included marauding armies from Scotland, who attacked the city on a number of occasions as they advanced southwards, as well as the parliamentarians in the English Civil War, who laid siege to the city of York for nearly 3 months in 1644, eventually emerging victorious and removing the royalist garrison from the city. At this point, however, no walls were needed, because of the natural defence that was provided by the waters of the River Ouse. To enter the city from the north, an advancing army had either to break through the walls, or to pierce through the very narrow and very obvious waterborne opening here, which was overlooked by a pair of medieval towers, now connected by this bridge. The Ouse is spanned here by the Lendal Bridge, a Victorian-era river crossing which was built back in 1863, designed by one Thomas Page, the same engineer who designed the famous Westminster Bridge down in London. But unlike the Ouse Bridge, which we crossed earlier, and which has a history dating back to the Roman era, the Lendal Bridge here is a purely modern bridge, because before the 1860s, the only way of crossing the river here was by ferry. For a long time, the ferry here wasn't too much of an inconvenience, but when the railways arrived into York, more and more people began needing to cross the river, with the Lendal ferry here becoming busier than ever before. Sensibly, a bridge was then built to provide a direct walking route between the historic city centre and the railway station, an extremely useful link that tens of thousands of people use every day now. But once upon a time, people would disembark the Lendal ferry in the shadow of this mighty medieval tower, the Lendal Tower, which was originally built around the year 1300. The other side of the bridge, meanwhile, is marked by a Victorian toll booth, because when the bridge first opened, people had to pay to use it, a halfpenny for pedestrians and twopence for horse-drawn carriages. Thankfully, the bridge has been free to walk over since 1894, and it brings us back to the eastern bank of the Ouse here, home to yet more fetching buildings like River House, originally built as the home of the Yorkshire Club, a prestigious private members' club of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. York, as the spiritual heart of Yorkshire, was the perfect place to host the club, and the city is home to plenty more sites of county-wide importance, most notably the Yorkshire Museum, which we'll find inside the city's beautiful museum gardens just off this street, the sensibly named Museum Street. Now, before the museum existed, this street was just a narrow lane known as Footloose Lane, an unusual moniker which may have been coined in reference to the fact that many people who came here struggled to walk, because they were visiting the historic St Leonard's Hospital, once the largest hospital in all of England. And hidden just here in the corner of the museum gardens, we find the ruins of St Leonard's Hospital, originally established all the way back in the year 1137 AD. The hospital, which was run by an order of monks, was founded to care for the ill and infirm of the growing medieval city, and it spanned a much larger area than what remains today, with space for more than 200 hospital beds. What we do see today is just a fragment of the hospital, the undercroft, the lowest floor of the building, and the chapel, all that remains standing, nearly 500 years after the hospital was forcefully closed down, on the orders of none other than King Henry VIII. During the Reformation of the 16th century, Henry VIII, who appointed himself supreme head of the Church of England, ordered the dissolution and destruction of monasteries all over the country, and that included the religious aspects of hospitals like St Leonard's here, the principal hospital serving the major city of York. Incredibly, St Leonard's destruction left York without a hospital, and the city remained without one for roughly 200 years afterwards, until a hospital was finally built in 1740 to alleviate the pressure on the city's continually rising population. But the remains of St Leonard's Hospital aren't the only historic ruins that you'll find in York's delightful museum gardens. As we pass by the entry to this fetching city park, which was originally created in the 1830s, among the museum garden's sprawling lawns beside the River Ouse, there lie Roman-era ruins and the spectacular remains of one of England's wealthiest abbeys, another victim of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. Some are easy to spot, but some you need to keep your eyes peeled for. For instance, behind this Christmas present, and between the trees, we can see towards part of York's city walls. But this section is unlike any that we've visited so far on our walk. If you look carefully, you'll notice that the stones used to build this part of the walls are different to most other places around the city. And that's because this section is actually one of the last remaining from the original Roman walls which encircled Eboracum. The Multangular Tower in front of us here was likely built around 1700 years ago in the 4th century, while the adjacent stone wall is thought to be roughly 100 years older, dating to the 3rd century. Facing down towards the river, that part of the Roman walls was retained during the medieval expansion of the fortifications centuries later, and they remain standing today nearly 2,000 years after they were first built, just beside the much younger Yorkshire Museum. Opened back in 1830, along with the surrounding gardens, the Yorkshire Museum began life as an archaeological collection, and over time it's expanded to encompass a vast array of artefacts discovered in and around England's largest county. Inside you'll find everything from statues of Roman emperors to Anglo-Saxon armour, Viking treasures and medieval jewels, illustrating just how varied and storied the heritage of Yorkshire is. The building also looks absolutely wonderful as it's lit up by the late afternoon sun, while the rest of the gardens gradually begin to be covered in shade. With a few furry friends hopping about the lawns, the museum gardens here are a wonderful oasis of nature and space just a stone's throw from the busy and narrow streets of the historic city centre, providing the perfect place to kick back and relax after a long walk around York. But as we know well, we're never far from history in this city, and just here we're passing by the eye-catching Hospitium, a gorgeous building which dates to the 14th century, possibly built as a barn or a guest house for visitors to the neighbouring St Mary's Abbey, the historically significant monastery which now stands in ruins in the museum gardens, and which we'll take a closer look at in a couple of moments. Because as the sun goes down over the gardens and the streetlights begin to flicker into life, hidden on the opposite side of the museum gardens from where we entered, there stand a couple more interesting landmarks, which once again have centuries of history under their belts. Now before these gardens were laid out in the 1830s, this land beside the River Ouse belonged entirely to St Mary's Abbey, once upon a time one of the most prosperous abbeys not just in York, but all of England. The abbey existed for around 450 years in the medieval era, beginning life around a small church which stood just here, the Church of St Olive. Standing on the same site today is a descendant of that original church, this place of worship rebuilt in the 15th century and dedicated to the patron saint of Norway, an indication of the lasting Scandinavian influence on this city. Just across the path from the church, meanwhile, there stands St Mary's Lodge, also dating from the 15th century, and which was built at the main entry to the main abbey complex, also serving as a guest house for those visiting the highly influential monastery. Now, as we've mentioned, St Mary's Abbey, established all the way back in the year 1088 AD, was one of the wealthiest institutions in medieval York, covering a huge area just outside the city walls here. Alongside the imposing towers of York Minster, the abbey was home to its own tall tower, which stood as one of the dominant features on the city's skyline for centuries. But as we can see here, very little remains of what was once one of York's largest and most prestigious landmarks. Here we're walking through what was once the door into the nave, the main body of the abbey church, where monks would have come to worship. Surrounding this building was a vast complex of facilities. Monks would have eaten at the refectory, roughly beside where the Yorkshire Museum is today, while the abbot, the leader of the abbey and one of England's wealthiest men at the time, lived just a few feet away from this point. But of course the ruins of the abbey church here tell us that the story of St Mary's Abbey didn't have a happy ending. It was one of the hundreds of victims of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, when the king seized the assets of monasteries all over the country for the crown, not only seizing their property, money and land, but going so far as to strip buildings like the abbey church here to the bare bones, with just the stone walls left to decay. Over the following centuries, the abbey church dilapidated even further, as the people of York took its stones to build other buildings around the city. The Lendal Tower by the river, that we saw a few moments ago for instance, thought to be built of many stones which once stood in the abbey church here. This period of total neglect continued right up until the 19th century, when plans for the museum gardens were first conceived. Owing to its historical significance, what remained of the abbey became a highly valuable relic of the past, and so it eventually became protected as a scheduled monument, a monument of national importance, the same status held by world-famous landmarks like Stonehenge. Today, the remains of St Mary's Abbey are simply unmissable for anybody visiting York, although not all of the old abbey complex lies in ruin. Just a short distance away, the former abbot's house remains standing, and actually remains in use. So from here we're going to make our way out of the museum gardens, and towards the former abbot's house, which we'll find just beside York's main art gallery and the iconic Bootham Bar, the gate which will take us back inside the walled city. Here we're passing by yet more of the Abbey Church ruins, with its layout still clearly visible from the stone foundations in the grass. Measuring more than 300 feet in length, the Abbey Church was about 2/3 as long as York Minster, a sign of its wealth and significance, although it did exist largely separate from the rest of the city inside the walls, with monks operating in a mostly self-sufficient environment. The rest of York was generally poorer, but much livelier than those living at the monastery here, with all of the ups and downs of the city's roughly 2,000 years of history unfolding mostly inside the bounds of the city walls. When you hear about the history of York, the tale generally begins with the Romans, but the truth is that there are a few morsels of history which we can learn about from even before this place became Eboracum, mostly through the city's name. It's believed that people have been living in the area that we now know as York since as long as 9,000 years ago, but these likely weren't permanent settlements, and so this part of Britain was mostly untapped meadowland, sparsely inhabited by tribal Britons. But the distinguishing feature of this place among the vast countryside was the presence of yew trees, and so the Britons came to refer to this place as the place of the yew trees, or in their language, Iburacon. Upon their conquest, the Romans adapted this name into Eboracum, but it clearly didn't stick through the rest of history. After all, York doesn't sound much like Eboracum. Well, that's actually not the case, because over the course of 2,000 years, Eboracum did in fact evolve into York, although it took a lot of different steps to get to this point. After the Romans abandoned York in the 5th century, the former city was settled by the Angles, who arrived from modern-day Denmark and Germany, and they adapted the name Eboracum into their language, knowing it as Eovorwic. But this caused the inferred meaning of the city's name to change, now literally translating as something like Wild Boar Village rather than Yew Tree Place. And so when the Vikings arrived in the 9th century, they took this new meaning for their name for the city, Jorvik. And so it was at this point when things started to sound a little more like the modern city, Jorvik gradually evolving into Yerk, then Yark, and then York as we know it today. And while we've been discovering the history of York's name, we still haven't left the bounds of the old St Mary's Abbey, this wall marking the northeastern boundary of the vast abbey complex. As we know, the vast majority of the abbey was destroyed after its dissolution by Henry VIII, and while some parts do remain in situ, others have been largely paved over by newer landmarks, such as the area that we find just here. This small square is known as Exhibition Square, and it takes its name from the very first Yorkshire Art and Industrial Exhibition, which was held in this part of the city back in 1866. The square is now home to York Art Gallery here, which opened its doors back in 1882, and which now houses a vast collection of more than 20,000 works, many on display for the public, who can enter the gallery absolutely free. But just next door to the art gallery, we find the last remaining building from St Mary's Abbey, this once having been the Abbot's House. Today, though, it's more commonly known as the King's Manor, and that's because after the dissolution of St Mary's Abbey, the abbot was kicked out from his house here, and it was taken into the possession of the Crown. In fact, kings including Henry VIII, Charles I and James I all stayed here on visits to the city of York. Located away from the cramped and often chaotic streets inside the walls, monarchs were often treated with a simple walk from the King's Manor towards York Minster, which we can see towering above the houses just a short distance away from us now. So it's nearly time to venture back inside the walled city for the last time, and we'll be entering this time by way of another of York's 4 main gates. This is the Bootham Bar, which is often touted as the oldest of York's main gates, parts of its stonework dating all the way back to the 11th century. Facing northwest, this was the gate which often bore the brunt of any attacks on York by the Scots, and as such it was another which often displayed the severed heads of traitors to scare off any potential raiders. Immediately outside the gate here is yet more of the old abbey wall, just a few feet from the boundaries of the city centre, despite the two being largely separate and on occasions at odds with one another. The area which encompassed the abbey just outside the walls here is traditionally known as Bootham, a name which is thought to derive from the booths, or stalls, of markets which were held on the exterior of the walled city, just outside the gate, which then became known as the Bootham Bar. As we now make our way through the bar, the gate as we see it today is actually much taller than how it started out. Originally, a Roman gateway stood on this site, granting access towards the Basilica, the headquarters of Eboracum, but it was later replaced by a shorter, single-storey gateway. It was only in the 14th century, with the wider strengthening of the city walls, that Bootham Bar was heightened, in order to incorporate a fearsome portcullis to improve security. The gate then gives way to the street known as High Petergate, where we find the small hole-in-the-wall pub, which no doubt takes its name from the gate, or hole in the wall, that it stands just beside. Now that we're back inside the walls, the pub is one of a dense collection of historic York landmarks to be found on this small street. In fact, just across the road from this row of 15th century houses is a slightly newer building, known as Petergate House. Petergate House, as we see it today, is largely of the Georgian era, but it has a longer history. In fact, back in the 17th century, it was the home of a man named Thomas Herbert, who was a close confidant of none other than King Charles I. So much so that Herbert actually stood alongside the king at his execution in 1649. So along just this small stretch of High Petergate, we've got buildings that date from a range of different eras, between the 11th and 19th centuries. And in all likelihood, there are some Roman remains hiding somewhere beneath the pavement too. But of course, High Petergate's most famous landmark is York Minster, the mighty medieval cathedral which we've been able to spot from a fair distance at different parts of the city, illuminated beautifully by the setting sun. As we mentioned at the start of our walk, the elegantly decorated towers of the cathedral's west facade here provide a spectacular sight, dwarfing pretty much every other building in the city. In fact, owing to historical protection, York Minster remains the tallest building in York to this day, still dominating the city skyline as it has done for hundreds of years. However, having begun our walk at York Minster more than an hour ago, and having made our way around a good proportion of the city centre, it's only right that we should bring our tour to an end here. Believe me, after more than an hour of exploration, we've still only just scratched the surface of York's incredible history. There's just so much to see and discover from the city's 2,000 years of heritage that we'd have to keep walking deep into the night to cover it all. But from what we've seen, it's undeniable that York is one of Britain's very best cities for anybody who loves history, beautiful architecture, illustrious railway heritage, strange street names, and even the Harry Potter stories. And so if you ever have the chance to visit this city and explore it just as we've done today, I couldn't recommend it more. Unfortunately though, it's here in the delightful Dean's Park that we've now come to the end of our walk around York. I'll leave you with a view of the mighty York Minster, and say a very big thank you for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now eagerly planning your own trip to York sometime soon.